A work of fiction. All characters, locations, and events in this story are entirely imaginary and created for the purpose of narrative storytelling. Any resemblance to real persons or places is coincidental. The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft, the paper worn thin at the corners where Vera Ashton's fingers had worried it down to something close to cloth. She had read it on the eastbound coach, then again at the way station where the horses were changed, then again in the gray hours before dawn when sleep would not come, and the road stretched on without mercy. She did not need to read it anymore. She had every word by heart, but holding it gave her hands something to do, and her hands, when left to themselves, had a tendency to shake. The coach rolled into Harrow Bend on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the color of old pewter and the wind came down off the high country with a bite that belonged to a different season. Vera stepped down onto the packed dirt of the main street and stood for a moment with the letter in her hand and her traveling bag at her feet, looking at a town that looked back at her with the particular indifference of a place that had seen too many strangers arrive and too many of them stay too long. Harrow Bend was not small exactly, but it wore its size carefully, the way a woman wears a dress she has not yet decided whether to keep. There was a general store with a covered porch, a livery stable with one door hanging at an angle, a church at the far end of the street with a bell that was probably not rung often enough. Between these anchors, a scattering of smaller buildings leaned against one another like tired men at the end of a long day. The whole place smelled of horses and wood smoke and something underneath both of those things, something older, like earth that had been turned over and left to dry. Vera picked up her bag and walked toward the building that had the word Justice carved into the wood above its door, because that was where she had been told to go, and because she had not come all this way to stand in the street and reconsider. The man behind the desk inside was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was older, with the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of guessing at ages, and he wore his authority the way the town wore its size, carefully and without particular pleasure. He looked up when she came in, and then he looked at the letter she set on the desk in front of him, and something in his expression shifted in a way she could not quite read. "Vera Ashton," she said, "I've come about a contract." The man looked at the letter. Then he opened a drawer and took out a folded document and set it beside the letter, smoothing it flat with the palm of his hand. He did not speak immediately, which she had learned to distrust in officials of any kind. Silence from a man in a position of authority was rarely a good sign. It meant he was deciding how much to tell you, and how to arrange it so that it sounded like everything. "This is the contract," he said finally. Vera looked at it. The document was 2 pages, written in a careful hand, laying out the terms of a betrothal agreement between one Sutter Graye, rancher, of Duskfield, and one Vera Ashton, currently of the Eastern Territories. Terms to be fulfilled upon her arrival at Harrow Bend on a date to be determined by the parties. It was all very orderly. It was all very specific. And at the bottom of the second page, in handwriting that was almost hers, was a signature that was not. She had known it would be there. She had known since the letter from the stagecoach company reached her 3 weeks ago, asking to confirm her travel arrangements, mentioning the name Sutter Graye, mentioning Harrow Bend, mentioning a contract that had been filed with the local justice. She had known then that Doyle had gone further than she had imagined. But knowing a thing and seeing it are not the same, and looking at the signature on that page, at the careful mimicry of her own hand, she felt something in her chest go very quiet, "That's not my signature," she said. The justice looked at her without surprise, which was itself surprising. "It is quite similar to the one on the letter you just placed on my desk." "Similar," Vera said, "is not the same as identical, and neither of them is mine. I did not sign this document. I was not in this territory when this document was signed. I did not agree to any of these terms." The justice folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Ashton, the contract was filed by your brother, Doyle Ashton, acting," he stated, "as your authorized representative. He is not my authorized representative. He has never been my authorized representative. He is my brother, which is an entirely different thing, and in his case, considerably less." She became aware then of another presence in the room, a stillness near the far wall that had the particular quality of someone who had been there for some time and had decided not to announce himself. She turned. The man standing near the window was tall without making a performance of it, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked with his body rather than for the impression it created. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a year or two beyond, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that gave very little away. He wore a rancher's clothes, worn at the knees and cuffs in patterns that spoke of specific labor repeated over years. He was watching her with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite sympathy, but existed in the territory between them, like a man who has heard many explanations and is reserving judgment on this one. "Mr. Graye," the justice said, with the tone of a man who has just remembered a piece of furniture he should have introduced earlier. The man by the window said nothing. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since she turned, steady and unhurried, like a man accustomed to assessing things that were not immediately clear. "The contract bears your name," he said finally. His voice was level, not unkind, but carrying no warmth either. It was the voice of someone who had decided long ago not to spend warmth where it might not be warranted. "It bears my name written by someone else's hand," Vera said. "My brother filed this document without my knowledge or consent. He took money from you, I presume, on the basis of an arrangement I knew nothing about. He is not in this room because he is not in this town, and I expect he has not been for some time." Something moved across Sutter Graye's face. Not surprise. She had the sense that he had already suspected something like this, that he had come to this office today already carrying a version of this conversation in his mind, and was now watching it unfold with the grim patience of a man confirming what he had hoped was wrong. The justice cleared his throat. "The contract, as filed, is a legal document. Without evidence to contradict it, it stands as valid. The process to contest it would require—" "I know what the process requires," Vera said. "It requires Doyle Ashton to appear before you and acknowledge what he did. Or it requires witnesses, or documentation that proves I was elsewhere when this signature was made. I am working on obtaining that documentation. In the meantime, I am here without funds, without acquaintance, and without the man who put me in this position, because he does not have the character to remain in a place where consequences might find him." She had not meant to say so much. She had meant to be precise and unemotional, to present the facts in the order they occurred and wait for the appropriate response. But there was something about standing in a strange room with a strange man's name attached to hers on a piece of paper she had never touched that made precision feel insufficient. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved along the street, and somewhere in the distance a horse objected to something. It was Sutter Graye who spoke next, and what he said was not what she anticipated. Your brother, he said slowly. How long have you been looking for him? Vera looked at him. 3 weeks. He nodded once, the smallest possible movement. Then he picked up his hat from where it rested on the windowsill, turned it once in his hands, and looked at the justice. I'll take responsibility for her board while the matter is sorted. The justice blinked. Mr. Graye, she came a long way on the basis of a document that has her name on it. That document was filed with my money. The least that buys her is a place to sleep while the situation gets resolved. He looked at Vera then, and his eyes were not warm, but they were honest, which she had learned to value considerably more. Unless you have other arrangements, she did not. They both knew she did not. I don't require charity, she said. It's not charity, he said. It's a practical arrangement. The town already thinks you're here under that contract. If you leave without resolution, they'll assume I was made a fool of, and I'll hear about it until spring. So it serves me as much as it serves you. He put his hat on. I have a ranch to get back to. The offer stands until this evening, if you want to consider it. He walked out without waiting for her answer. The door closed behind him with a sound that was not quite a slam, just firm, the door of a man who was not angry, but was done. Vera stood in the justice's office for a moment after he left, looking at the contract on the desk, at the signature that was almost hers. Then she folded it carefully, the same way she folded her own letter, along the existing lines, and handed it back to the justice. I'll need a copy of that eventually, she said. Of course, he said, in the voice of a man who was very glad his part of this particular scene was apparently over. She retrieved her bag from outside and found Sutter Graye waiting with a wagon at the end of the street, not looking at her, not ignoring her either, simply present in the way a man is present when he has made a decision and is waiting for the world to catch up with it. She put her bag in the back and climbed up to the seat without assistance, because she had not asked for any. They drove out of Harrow Bend in silence. The road rose gradually away from the town into open country, and the sky ahead of them was beginning to break in places, pale light coming through the clouds in long slanted columns that touched the land and then withdrew, like something considering whether to stay. The contract, Vera said after a while. How much did he take from you? Sutter kept his eyes on the road. Enough. I intend to see it returned. That's between you and your brother. My brother doesn't have it anymore. He never keeps anything for long. She watched the landscape pass, the dry grass bending in the wind, the distant line of hills going dark against the lighter sky. I want you to understand that I came here to find him, not to honor a document I didn't sign. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not here to be someone's arranged wife. He glanced at her then, brief and direct. I didn't send for an arranged wife. I sent for... He stopped himself too. It doesn't matter what I sent for. It's not what arrived. There was nothing cruel in it. It was simply accurate, the kind of statement a man makes when he has grown tired of softening the edges of things. She found she did not mind it. Softened edges had a way of hiding what was underneath, and she had cut herself on hidden things often enough. Duskfield Ranch appeared around a long curve in the road, and Vera's first impression was of scale. The house was not large, but it was solid, built from timber and stone, in the manner of something meant to last rather than to impress, with a covered porch running along the front and windows that were small and deep-set, the way eyes are set back under a heavy brow. Behind it, the outbuildings spread across a wide yard, a barn, a smaller shed, a structure she could not immediately identify. Beyond all of it, the land opened up into grassland that ran to the foot of the hills. It was, she thought, the kind of place that would be beautiful if someone was looking at it with the right feeling. She was not sure yet what feeling she had about it. Sutter stopped the wagon and climbed down and took her bag from the back before she could reach it, carrying it toward the house without comment. She followed him through the front door into a main room that was functional and spare, with a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with a low fire already burning. There was a bookshelf with perhaps a dozen books on it, most of them leaning against one another for support. There was a hook by the door with a single coat on it. There was no excess in the room, nothing kept for decoration or sentiment, except that when she turned toward the fireplace, she noticed the mantel, and on the mantel, turned with its face to the wall, a framed photograph. She did not look at it for long. She looked away before he could notice her looking. He led her down a short hallway to a door on the right, opened it, and set her bag inside. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that faced east. On the floor beside the bed, a folded blanket. On the small table near the window, a candle. Simple things set out with care. The care of someone who had prepared the room for a specific purpose and was now watching that purpose arrive in a form he had not anticipated. He reached into his pocket and held out a key. She took it. "Door locks from the inside," he said. "From the outside, too, if you're going out and want it secured." She turned the key over in her hand. It was a plain iron key, worn smooth from use or from being carried for some time in anticipation. "You prepared this room," she said. "Yes." "Before I arrived." "Yes." She looked up at him. He met her eyes without flinching, without apology, without the particular expression men sometimes wore when caught in an act of quiet consideration, the expression that wanted credit for the thing without having to explain it. He simply acknowledged it as fact. The room had been prepared. She was here now. That was the situation. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and turned to go. "Mr. Graye." He stopped in the doorway. She was not sure, yet, what she wanted to say. What question would be the right one to begin with? There were many questions. She settled on the practical one. "How long do you think the process will take to resolve the contract?" He was quiet for a moment. "Depends on your brother. Everything always does," she said. And she had not meant it to carry as much as it did, but the words came out weighted with something she had not entirely planned, and she heard it in the air after she spoke, and so did he. She saw it in the slight change in his posture, the almost imperceptible pause before he moved. He left without answering, which was itself a kind of answer. Vera set her bag on the bed and stood in the center of the small room and breathed. Outside the window, the wind was moving across the grass in long, slow waves, bending it all in one direction and then releasing it over and over. The way water moves over something that holds its shape despite the pressure. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook behind the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The blanket was thick wool, dark gray, not new, but not worn through. She put her hand on it and felt the weight of it, the realness of it, the way it existed in this specific place at this specific moment, and was simply what it was. Then she crouched down and looked under the bed. She did not know what made her do it. Something about the room, perhaps, or the way it had been prepared with care for someone who was supposed to want to be here. She looked under the bed, and in the shadow, there she saw it. A small shoe, leather, sized for a child of perhaps 3 or 4 years, the sole worn thin in the way of something used daily and then abruptly no longer used. It was not hidden. It had simply been left there, in the way that things are left when the person who might have moved them could not bring themselves to do it. Vera looked at the shoe for a long time. Then she stood up and sat back on the bed and looked at the window where the light was coming through in the long, slanted way it had been doing all morning, considering and withdrawing, and then considering again. She did not move the shoe. She left it exactly where it was. Outside, she heard the sound of Sutter Graye moving across the yard, the purposeful rhythm of a man returning to work, the creak of a door, the quiet that settled after. And in the quiet, she sat with the key in her hand and the shoe under the bed, and the knowledge that she had come here looking for her brother and had arrived at something considerably more complicated. She thought about what he had said in the wagon, the beginning of a sentence he had not finished. "I sent for." And then the stop, the retreat, the practical reframing. She had learned in years of watching her father and then her brother that what a man did not finish saying was often more honest than what he said out loud. Whatever Sutter Graye had sent for, it was not this. But he had prepared the room anyway. He had put out the candle and the blanket, and he had given her the key. And sometime tonight she would lie in this bed, in this room, in this place that was not hers. And she would listen to the wind and think about the signature at the bottom of that contract, so close to hers that she had looked twice. She would think about Doyle and all the things he had taken from her over the years, the small things first and then the larger ones, and how each time she had told herself it was the last, and each time it had not been. She would think about what she had said to the justice about documentation and witnesses and the process for contesting a fraudulent contract, and she would remind herself that she had not come all this way to stay. She had come to find Doyle and make him answer for what he had done. And then she would leave this ranch, and this strange, quiet man, and this town with its pewter sky, and its leaning buildings, and its wind that could not make up its mind. She would leave. That had always been the plan. Vera set the key on the small table beside the candle and lay back on the bed with her coat over her like a second blanket, and stared at the ceiling and listened to Harrow Bend settling into the afternoon around her, the distant sounds of the ranch at work, the creak of timber, the occasional low complaint of cattle somewhere in the distance, the wind moving through the eaves in a long, searching sound, like something trying to find a way in. She was asleep before she knew she was tired. She woke before the light came, in that hour when the darkness has begun to thin but has not yet committed to ending, when shapes emerge from shadow without quite becoming themselves. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The ceiling was wrong, too low, too close, the smell of the room unfamiliar, wood and old wool and something faint underneath, like dried lavender left too long in a drawer. Then it came back to her in the orderly way that facts return after sleep, not all at once but in sequence, each one arriving and taking its place. Harrow Bend. The justice's office, the contract with the signature that was almost hers, the key on the table beside the candle. Sutter Graye. She lay still for a moment and listened to the ranch. It was not silent. A ranch before dawn is never silent, she was learning. There were the sounds of animals shifting in the barn, the creak of the structure itself in the wind, the occasional low sound from somewhere in the yard that she could not identify, but that felt purposeful, as though the place were already at work before anyone had asked it to be. She heard footsteps on the porch, deliberate and unhurried, and then the soft close of a door, and then nothing but the wind again. He was already up. She had the sense he was always already up, that sleep was something he did out of necessity rather than inclination, the way a man drinks water when he must and does not linger over it. She rose and dressed in the gray dark and splashed cold water from the basin on the windowsill onto her face. And when she looked in the small square of mirror propped against the wall, she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had traveled a long way and had not yet decided whether the destination was worth it. She smoothed her hair and did not spend more time on the question. The kitchen was empty, but the stove was already warm. A low fire banked underneath, and there was a pot of coffee on the iron surface that was not quite hot, but was not cold either. She found a cup on the shelf, plain white ceramic with a small chip at the rim, and poured it, and stood at the window drinking it and looking out at the yard where the first gray light was beginning to separate the barn from the sky behind it. Sutter came in from outside while she was still standing there, bringing the cold air with him on his coat. He stopped when he saw her, just briefly, the slight adjustment of a man who has grown accustomed to empty rooms and then finds one occupied. He hung his coat on the hook by the door and went to the stove and poured his own coffee without comment. "I didn't know how early you started," she said. "Cattle don't keep a schedule that suits people," he said. He stood at the other end of the kitchen counter with his cup and looked out the same window she was looking out, so they were both facing the same direction, which made the conversation feel less like a confrontation than it might have otherwise. "I can be useful," she said. "I don't intend to stay in that room and wait for things to sort themselves out." He looked at her sideways. "What do you know how to do?" It was not a dismissive question. It was a practical one, asked by a man taking inventory of available resources, which she supposed was fair enough. "I can ride, not well by your standards, probably, but adequately. I know the basics of livestock, enough not to do harm. I'm better with figures and records than with animals, and I can manage a kitchen well enough that you won't have to." He considered this the way he seemed to consider most things, without rushing. "Books are in the study," he said finally. "Second door on the left. They haven't been looked at properly in a while." He drank his coffee. "If you want to start there." She did want to start there. She wanted to start somewhere, anywhere, because standing still had never been something she managed gracefully, and the prospect of spending her days in the small room watching the east-facing window was not one she could sustain. She nodded, and that was the arrangement, struck without ceremony over cooling coffee in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and the particular silence of two people who had not yet found their common language. The study was not much larger than her bedroom. There was a desk against the far wall, a lamp, a wooden chair that had been repaired at one leg with a different timber than the rest, and on the desk a collection of ledgers and loose papers that had the appearance of something organized long ago and then left to drift. She sat down and drew the nearest ledger toward her and opened it. It took her 2 hours to understand the shape of the problem, and another hour to understand how it had been hidden. Not intentionally, she thought, or not entirely. A man who worked as hard as Sutter Graye clearly worked did not have time to keep records with the precision they required, and what had likely begun as a minor disorder had compounded over time into something that obscured the ranch's actual position. There were expenses recorded twice, income from cattle sales that did not match the corresponding entries elsewhere, a discrepancy in the grain accounts that ran back through several seasons. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was manageable. But the cumulative effect was a set of books that told a story about Duskfield that was less accurate than the ranch deserved and considerably less flattering. She worked through the morning without stopping, making notes in the margin of a clean sheet she found in the desk drawer, tracking the discrepancies by date and category. When she found the error in the water rights records, she set down her pen and sat back and looked at the ceiling. The error was small, a transposition of figures in an agreement filed several seasons past, but its effect on the running total of the account associated with the water rights was significant enough to make Duskfield appear to owe more than it did to the shared water agreement with the neighboring properties. She did not know yet what that meant for the ranch's standing in the community or its relationship with whoever controlled the other properties on the water agreement, but she knew it was not nothing. And she knew it had not been there by accident, because transpositions of this specific kind did not happen by accident. She had seen it before, in her father's accounts, in the years when things were going wrong in ways that were not obvious until they were. She did not say anything at the midday meal, which was a brief affair of bread and cold meat at the kitchen table, Sutter arriving from outside with dirt on his hands and a preoccupied air that suggested his morning had not resolved whatever it had set out to resolve. They ate in a silence that was becoming, she thought, slightly less uncomfortable than it had been over coffee, which was perhaps progress of a kind. In the afternoon, she walked into town. She had not announced her intention to do so, and Sutter had not asked her plans, and she had simply put on her coat and her hat and walked the road back toward Harrow Bend with the wind at her back and the list of questions in her mind arranged by priority. She wanted to learn what the town knew about Doyle. She wanted to learn what it knew about Cress Holt. And she wanted to do both of those things without letting the town learn what she was looking for, which required a particular kind of conversation, the kind where you listened more than you spoke, and asked questions that sounded like something other than questions. The general store was the obvious place to start. It was where information lived in a town like this, collected and sorted and redistributed by whoever stood behind the counter with sufficient interest in the neighbors. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 55, with a sharp face and the kind of eyes that had been watching people long enough to have developed opinions about all of them. Her name, as established by the small wooden sign on the counter, was Mrs. Graye, and she looked at Vera with the particular expression of a woman who has already formed a hypothesis and is now collecting evidence to support it. "You'll be the Ashton woman," Mrs. Graye said, not unfriendly, informational. "Vera," she said, "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I'll be at Duskfield for a time while some legal matters are sorted." Mrs. Graye nodded as though this confirmed something. "Harrow Bend is a small town," she said, by which she meant that she already knew considerably more than Vera had offered. "We were surprised when Mr. Graye filed that contract. He's not a man who does things without thinking them through." "He didn't file it," Vera said pleasantly. "My brother acted on his behalf. It's one of the matters being sorted." Mrs. Graye's eyes sharpened. "Your brother was here," she said. 3 months ago, perhaps 4. Doyle, he said his name was. Stayed at the boarding house a week, spent money freely, talked to everyone." She paused. "He was very easy to talk to." "He always has been," Vera said. "Did he speak with anyone in particular?" There was a brief pause, the kind that meant yes, but was considering how to say it. "He spent time with Mr. Holt's man," Mrs. Graye said finally. "The one who handles business for the Holt property. Came in here with him twice. I didn't think much of it at the time. Vera bought a spool of thread she did not need, and a tin of tea she did, and she thanked Mrs. Graye for her time, and walked back out into the main street of Harrow Bend with the information settling into its place alongside the ledger error and the water rights discrepancy, forming a shape that was becoming clearer. The more pieces she found, the way a landscape emerges from fog, not all at once but feature by feature, until you can see enough of it to know where you are. Cress Holt. She had a name to put to the shape now. She was halfway down the street when she became aware of the man walking toward her from the direction of the livery stable, and she had just enough time to register that he was looking at her with a recognition that she did not share before he was close enough to stop. He was large, with the deliberate ease of a man who had never had cause to make himself smaller, dressed in clothes that were expensive in a way that was meant to be noticed. His face was broad and not unpleasant, and he wore his confidence the way some men wore their hats, as though it had been there so long he no longer felt it. "You must be the Ashton woman," he said, and it had a different quality than when Mrs. Crail had said it, something proprietary in it, something that was taking stock. "Vera Ashton," she said. She did not offer her hand. "And you are?" "Cress Holt," he said. "I own the property adjacent to Duskfield, among others." He looked at her with an open assessment that was not quite rude, but was several steps past courtesy. "I heard you'd arrived. Unexpected circumstances." "Unexpected for everyone," she said. "Yes." He smiled, and the smile was the kind that had a calculation behind it that it did not quite conceal. "Sutter Graye is not an easy man to do business with. He's stubborn about the property, about the water rights, about everything, really. I've made him fair offers over the years. He never takes them." He paused. "A shame, given the position he's in." "What position is that?" she asked, keeping her voice level and interested and nothing more. "A man alone is at a disadvantage in this country," Holt said pleasantly. "Duskfield is a good property, but good properties require good management, and management requires resources, connections, community standing." He looked at her in the way of a man making a point he expects to land. "These things are fragile." "They are," Vera agreed. "It's a good thing Mr. Graye appears to have managed them carefully." The smile stayed where it was, but something behind it adjusted. "Of course," he said. "I hope your legal matters resolve themselves quickly. Harrow Bend is a hospitable town, but situations like yours can attract talk. Talk is unavoidable," Vera said. "I found it's usually better to give people something accurate to talk about." She inclined her head. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holt." She walked on without looking back, and she kept her pace even and her spine straight, and she did not let any of what she was thinking arrive on her face until she was around the corner and out of the main street, at which point she stood against the wall of the feed merchant's building and breathed slowly and deliberately for a moment, the way she had learned to do in the years when breathing calmly was a skill that required practice. He was not a subtle man. That was something. Subtle men were harder to anticipate. Men like Holt moved in straight lines and assumed the directness was strength rather than transparency, and that assumption was often where they left openings they did not know they had left. She walked back to Duskfield in the late afternoon, with the wind in her face this time, and her mind working in the particular focused way it worked when something had come clear enough to act on. She did not have all of it yet, but she had enough of it to know what she was looking at. Sutter was in the yard when she came up the road, working at the fence line near the barn, replacing a post that had rotted through at the base. He did not look up immediately, and she did not call to him. She watched him work for a moment from a distance, the efficient economy of it, The way he set the new post and tamped the earth around it with a rhythm that suggested this was not the first time and would not be the last. A man who fixed things not because he expected them to stay fixed, but because they needed to be fixed now. And now was what he had to work with. Then he looked up and saw her standing at the edge of the yard, and something in his expression asked a question that his mouth did not. "I walked into town," she said. He set down the tamping tool. "I know. Mrs. Crail will have mentioned it to 4 people by supper." "She mentioned your water rights agreement," Vera said, "and that my brother spent time with one of Holt's men while he was here." Sutter went still. Not dramatically, not in the way of surprise, but in the way of a man who has heard something that confirms a suspicion he had been hoping was wrong. He picked up the tamping tool again and set it against the fence post, and then set it down a second time, which was more visible deliberation than she had yet seen from him. "Come inside," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, and she laid out what she had found in the ledgers, the discrepancies, the water rights error, the way the figures had been arranged to make Duskfield's position appear worse than it was. She did not editorialize. She went through it the way she would have gone through it for her father in the years when she had managed his accounts, with precision and sequence, letting the numbers make the argument because numbers were more persuasive than conclusions, and she did not want him to feel that she was reaching. He listened without interrupting. His face through all of it was very still, the face of a man receiving information he is organizing as it arrives, placing each piece in relation to the others, not responding until the picture was complete enough to respond to. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Outside, the light was going, the last of the afternoon sliding off the grass and leaving the yard in the gray that came before dark. "The water rights error," he said finally. "When was it entered?" she told him. He nodded, the nod of someone for whom this date meant something specific. "That was around the time Holt made his first offer on the property," he said. "I turned him down. 2 weeks later, the bank sent a letter about the water rights account balance." He looked at the table, not at her. "I assumed I'd miscounted." "You hadn't," she said. "No." He looked up at her then, and she saw in his eyes the particular expression of a man understanding that something he had thought was his own failure was not. It was not relief exactly. It was more complicated than relief. "No, I hadn't." She pushed the sheet of notes toward him across the table. He looked at them for a moment without touching them, then picked them up and read through with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was reading. "You found all of this today," he said. It was not quite a question. "The records weren't difficult to follow once I understood what I was looking for," she said. "They weren't meant to be obscured from the owner. They were meant to obscure the ranch's actual position from outside observers, from a bank or a court or a community water board." She paused. "From anyone making a determination about whether Duskfield was financially sound." He set the sheet down. "And my brother," Vera said, because it needed to be said, and she was not willing to leave it unsaid. "Doyle didn't choose you accidentally. Someone who knew your situation told him where to go and what to offer and what it would cost you to have the arrangement fall through. The contract, the filed documents, the money paid up front, and then nothing. It was designed to damage your reputation in the community at a specific moment." She kept her voice even. "I'm sorry that he was the instrument of it. That is not something I can fix. But I can tell you what I know, and I can help you understand what was done and how." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove had burned down to a low, steady glow, and the room had taken on the amber quality of late firelight, warm in a way that the rest of the day had not been. Sutter looked at the notes on the table for a long time. Then he looked at her, and it was a different look than the one he had given her in the justice's office, not assessing exactly, but attentive in a way that was less guarded, as though he was seeing her, specifically, rather than the situation she represented. "You could have kept this to yourself," he said. "Why would I?" "Because the worse my position looks, the more pressure there is to resolve the contract. If I'm in financial difficulty, the justice might expedite the process. It would get you out faster." She had not thought of it that way. She considered it now, briefly, and found that it did not change anything. "I'm not interested in getting out faster by leaving you worse off," she said. "That's not the kind of person I am." She paused. "And it wouldn't actually work. The contract is a separate matter from the ranch's finances." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, more the movement that happens in the vicinity of a smile when the person involved is not accustomed to the expression and does not want to commit to it without cause. "No," he said. "I suppose it wouldn't." He stood and went to the stove to put more wood on the fire, and she watched him do it. The practiced ease of a man in a space he had occupied long enough that every motion in it was automatic. When he turned back, the expression had settled into something quieter, not warm still, or not obviously, but something that had moved slightly in that direction, the way the temperature of a room shifts when a fire is fed, not transformed, just adjusted by a few degrees, in a way that made the difference between endurable and almost comfortable. "I'll look at the water rights records myself tomorrow," he said. "If the error is what you think it is, I'll need to bring it to the water board before Holt does." He looked at the window, at the dark that had arrived fully now, while they were talking. "He'll move when he thinks the time is right. We should move before that. We." She noticed the word, the easiness with which it had arrived, and she thought he noticed it too, a fraction of a second after he said it, because something in his posture adjusted slightly, not retreating exactly, just acknowledging. She did not remark on it. "I can have a clean copy of the corrected ledger entries ready by tomorrow evening," she said. "Something presentable to take to a board." He nodded. "That would be useful," he said. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the key on the table and listened to the ranch settle into the night around her. The sounds of it familiar now in a way they had not been that morning. The creak of the timbers, the wind in the eaves, the cattle in the distance. And underneath those sounds, from somewhere in the main room, the quiet sound of a man sitting alone by a fire, not moving, not speaking, just present in the particular way of someone who has received something unexpected and is trying to determine what to do with it. She did not look under the bed before she lay down. She did not need to. She already knew the shoe was there, and knowing was enough for now. The small, sad fact of it. The thing left behind in a room prepared for someone who was supposed to want to be here. The question Sutter had asked her in the wagon came back to her in the dark, the one she had not answered. Whether she wanted to find Doyle, or whether she only wanted to be free of the contract. She had not answered because she had not known, and she was not entirely certain she knew now. But she was beginning to think that what she wanted was not as simple as either option. What she wanted was something she did not yet have a name for. Something that had to do with the ledger on the desk and the water rights error and the man by the fire who had said we without intending to and had not taken it back. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind, and for the first time since she had read the letter from the stagecoach company 3 weeks ago, she did not feel the particular vertiginous sensation of standing on ground that was about to give way. The ground here was solid. Whether it was hers to stand on was a different question, and one she could not answer yet, but it was solid. And for tonight, that was enough. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Vera had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with. She rose before full light and made coffee and worked in the study until the morning was gone, correcting the ledger entries with the careful precision she had learned in her father's house, when keeping accurate records had been the difference between understanding what was happening and being surprised by it. Sutter came in from the yard at midday, and they ate and did not talk much. And in the afternoons, she sometimes walked out to where he was working and stood nearby, not helping exactly, but present in the way she had noticed he was present with things, close enough to matter, far enough not to crowd. It was not comfortable precisely. It was something adjacent to comfortable, the way two pieces of furniture from different sets can occupy the same room without being matched, each holding its own shape, but not fighting the other's presence either. She finished the corrected ledger on the third day and slid it across the table to him after supper. He read through it slowly, turning each page with the deliberate care of a man who wanted to understand what he was reading, rather than simply absorb it. When he reached the end, he closed it and sat with his hand flat on the cover for a moment, and she waited. "It's good work," he said. "It's accurate work," she said. "Whether it's enough depends on the water board. I'll take it to them at the end of the week." He looked up. "I'd like you to come." She had not expected that. "Why?" "Because you understand it better than I do. And if they have questions I can't answer, it will matter that someone there can." He paused. "And because Holt will likely be there. And it's better to have the full picture present than to give him room to introduce a different one." She thought about Holt on the street, his proprietary ease, the smile that calculated while it charmed. "All right," she said. He nodded and took the ledger and set it on the shelf where he kept the things that needed to be dealt with. And that was the end of it, except that it was not quite the end of it, because something had shifted in the way he moved in the room after that. Something so small she might not have noticed if she had not been paying attention, and she was always paying attention. He did not keep the same distance he had been keeping. Not closer, not in any way that announced itself, but the margin had contracted by some small measure, the way water settles after a disturbance, finding a new level without making a point of it. The horse's name was Cade, and he was the color of old iron, a gray gelding with a white mark above one eye that gave him the perpetual expression of mild surprise. She had noticed him in the first days because he stood apart from the other horses, not excluded, just separate in the way of a creature that has grown accustomed to its own company. When she went to the barn one afternoon to retrieve a tool she had left there, she found Sutter crouched near the horse's left foreleg, his hand moving slowly along the cannon bone, his face carrying the concentration of someone performing a specific diagnostic task. She started to back out quietly. He heard her anyway. "Come in," he said without looking up. "He won't spook." She came in and stood near the stall door and watched him work. His hands on the horse were different from his hands on everything else, she noticed, still precise, still economical, but with a quality of care in them that was not present when he was mending fence or turning pages. He found what he was looking for, some inflammation along the tendon, and he rocked back on his heels and looked at the leg for a moment with an expression that was, she thought, close to worry. "Is it serious?" she asked. "Could be, if it's not managed." He stood and moved to the shelf along the barn wall where various liniments and preparations were kept, taking down a tin with the ease of a man who knew exactly where everything lived. "He's old. Doesn't take as much as it used to cause a problem." "Whose horse was he?" The question came out before she considered it, prompted by something she had observed but not yet understood. The particular way Sutter's attention moved toward the gray gelding, the quality of it, different from how he watched the working horses. He did not answer immediately. He opened the tin and applied the liniment to the horse's leg with long, careful strokes, and she thought he might not answer at all, which she would have accepted. "My wife's," he said finally. "She left him here. Couldn't take him on the road," she said. "That was her reason." He kept his hands moving along the horse's leg. "Cade's been here 9 years. I've had him longer than I had the marriage." Vera said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be either too much or too little, and she had learned that silence, correctly timed, was not absence, but presence, the willingness to be in a moment without trying to change it. He finished with the liniment and stood and wiped his hands on a cloth from his back pocket, and he looked at the horse for another moment with that expression she could not quite name, the one that lived between grief and something more settled, something that had been grief long enough to know its own shape. "He's good company," Sutter said. "Doesn't ask for explanations." "No," Vera said. "Animals are merciful that way." He looked at her then, and there was something in it, in the look, that was more open than any she had received from him so far. Not vulnerable, exactly, but unguarded. The face of a man who has said something true in front of someone and is watching to see what they will do with it. She did nothing with it. She simply looked back, and the barn was quiet around them, and outside the wind moved through the yard, and Cade shifted his weight and made a low sound in his chest that was contentment or close to it. "I'll leave you to it," she said, and found the tool she had come for and walked back to the house. And she did not look back, because looking back would have made it something other than what it was. That night the storm came in from the northwest, the kind that arrived without a great deal of announcement and made itself known through the roof rather than the windows, rain driving across the shingles in long sweeping runs, the wind finding every gap in the old structure and inserting itself with enthusiasm. Vera lay in her room listening to it and reading by candlelight, and she heard the creak of the porch door and footsteps moving toward the barn, and she understood that Sutter was checking on the horses, checking on Cade. In the morning she went out before he came in and found that a section of the porch roof had separated at the join, a gap of perhaps a foot where the two sections met, enough to let the rain in if it came from the right direction, which it evidently had, given the puddle on the porch boards. She found tools in the shed and a length of board that would do for a patch, and she was halfway through the repair when she heard him come around the side of the house. He stopped when he saw her, the same slight adjustment she had noticed on the first morning, and then he looked at what she was doing. She had the board fitted along the gap and was attempting to hold it in place and drive the first nail simultaneously, which was not a task well suited to one person. He came up the porch steps without speaking and held the board flat against the join with both hands, steadying it, and she drove the nail and then the next two. And when the board was secured, he stepped back and looked at the repair with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of approval, which was simply the absence of the expression he wore when something was not right. "You don't have to fix things," he said. "I know," she said. "They needed fixing." He looked at her for a moment. "You've got the corner of the nail wrong on the second one. It'll work loose in a week." "Show me!" He took the hammer from her hand and demonstrated, resetting the nail at the angle that would hold. She watched his hands, the specific motion, and filed it away in the part of her mind that collected practical information and kept it. They worked the length of the porch in the thin morning light, finding 2 more places where the winter had done its work, and they fixed them one by one. And by the time it was done, the sun had burned off the last of the storm clouds, and the yard was wet and bright, every surface catching the light and holding it, the grass going green in a way it hadn't the day before. It was after supper that evening, the fire burning down low, that the conversation arrived that she had not expected but perhaps should have. She had asked him, not as a probe, but out of genuine curiosity, whether the water board meeting was the first time Holt had moved against the ranch officially, and what followed was not quite a story, but a sequence of events laid out in the spare factual way he had, each one placed beside the next without embellishment, a chronicle of small pressures applied over years, offers made and rejected, community perceptions shifted by degrees, a reputation built on hard work and quiet dealing slowly undermined by the whispers of a man with better access to the town's conversational channels. He was not asking for sympathy. She understood that. He was providing context, the way an experienced person provides context for a new one before a difficult task, because the task goes better when the full landscape is known. When he finished, she asked about the boy. She did not plan to. It came from the same place the question about Cade had come from, a pattern she had been observing and had not yet been able to account for. The small shoe, the careful room, the specific quality of absence in the house that was not the absence of a woman who had left, but of something more irretrievable. "The child," she said, "the shoe under the bed in my room." He was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer, and she would not have pressed him, would have let it go back under the surface where he kept it. But he answered. "Fen," he said, the name alone, for a moment. He was 4, almost 5. He looked at the fire. There was a sickness that went through the valley one winter. Hit the children harder than anyone else. We thought he was past the worst of it. And then he wasn't. His voice did not break. It was too controlled for that. Controlled in the way of a man who has said something many times in his own mind and has worn the edges smooth. 3 days. That's how fast it went at the end. Vera did not say she was sorry, because she had said it to people before when she meant it and always found it insufficient. A word that did not fit the size of what it was meant to address. She said, "What was he like?" The question surprised him. She saw it in the brief flicker of his expression, the slight recalibration. People did not usually ask that. They moved forward from the fact of the loss, rarely backward toward the person. "Loud," Sutter said, and something at the corner of his mouth moved. He was loud and always moving. Couldn't keep still. Used to follow me to the barn in the mornings and ask the same questions every day about the horses, what they were thinking, whether they knew their own names. He paused. He liked the gray. Cade used to let him stand on the fence and touch his nose. Stood there like a statue while Fen patted him. He stopped. The fire shifted in the grate, a log settling, throwing a brief pulse of light across the room and then subsiding. "I kept the shoe," he said. Not all of them. Just the one. I don't know why that particular one. He looked at his hands. My wife said I should put it away. I couldn't. After she left, I moved it to that room because I couldn't have it where I was sleeping anymore. But I couldn't. He stopped again. I didn't want to put it somewhere I couldn't find it. Vera looked at the fire and let the silence be what it was. Then she said, I won't move it. I left it where it was. He looked at her. I know, he said. I checked. There was a long quiet after that, the kind that had earned its own texture, not the careful quiet of two strangers avoiding topics, but the quiet of two people who have said something real and are letting it exist between them without immediately covering it over. She told him about Doyle then, without deciding to. About the years in her father's house where she had kept the accounts and managed the correspondence and understood clearly that none of it would ever be hers by law, that she was the useful daughter and Doyle was the inheriting son. And she had made her peace with that division in the way you make peace with weather, not because it was right, but because it was the condition of being where she was. And then her father had died, and the making peace had proved insufficient, because the law moved faster than peace, and Doyle had moved faster than the law. And within a season, she had gone from useful to unnecessary, and from unnecessary to a name on a contract she had never signed. He's not evil, she said. That would be simpler. He's just without weight. He doesn't feel the consequences of things. They happen, and then they're behind him, and he moves on. She looked at the fire. I've spent years trying to understand how someone raised in the same house becomes that, and I haven't found an answer. Some people just come out hollow, Sutter said. It's not always the house that made them. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, which made it easier for some reason. Easier to hear it plainly without the complication of being seen hearing it. No, she said. I suppose not. It was late when they said goodnight, later than either of them had been awake since she'd arrived, and the fire had burned fully down to coals, and the room had taken on the close, quiet warmth of a space that has been inhabited for hours by people who have, gradually and without announcement, become slightly less unknown to one another. She was at the door of the hallway when he spoke. Vera. She turned. He was still sitting at the table with his hands around the cooling cup, not looking at her yet. And then he did. The letter. The one you came with. Your brother's handwriting on it, not yours. Yes, when you found it in the Stagecoach Company's message, that was the first you knew he'd done this. Yes. He nodded slowly, and she had the sense this was not new information but confirmation of something he had already worked out, the same way he had worked out the water rights error, methodically, waiting until he was sure before acknowledging that he was. All right, he said. It was not forgiveness, because there was nothing of hers to forgive. It was something else, something more like the moment when a foundation is checked and found solid, when you put weight on a thing and it holds, and you know it will hold. She had not known she needed it until it arrived, and once it arrived, she felt it in the way you feel the end of a long walk, not the destination, but the ceasing, the particular relief of something strenuous becoming still. She said goodnight and went to her room and sat on the bed in the dark for a while without lighting the candle. Outside, the storm had gone entirely, and the sky had cleared, and through the window she could see a handful of stars coming in over the eastern ridge, bright and specific in the cleared air, the kind of stars that appear after rain, as though the washing has made everything more visible. She lay back and looked at the ceiling, and she thought about Doyle, who was somewhere in this territory, doing what he had always done, moving through other people's lives like a man who has never learned that the ground behind him stays disturbed after he passes. She thought about the water board meeting at the end of the week and the corrected ledger on the shelf and Holt's measuring smile on the main street of Harrow Bend. She thought about the gray horse standing still in the barn while a small boy reached up to touch his nose, and the patience of that, the enormous patience of allowing yourself to be touched by something you could easily move away from. She thought about Sutter saying "we" without meaning to. Somewhere in the house, she heard him go to bed, the quiet sequence of sounds that marked the end of his day. And then the house was still, and the stars were where they had been, and everything that was unresolved remained unresolved, sitting in its place with the solidity of things that do not move on their own. She reached down and pulled the thick gray blanket up and closed her eyes and did not think about leaving. Not tonight. Tonight she simply lay in the room that had been prepared for someone, in the house that had been holding its breath for a long time, and let herself occupy the space she was in without apology and without plan. That was, she thought, as close to rest as she was likely to get. It would have to be enough. And then, as it turned out, it was. Doyle came on a Thursday, which was the kind of detail that meant nothing and somehow meant everything, the way certain days acquire a weight after the fact that they did not carry before. Vera was in the study when she heard the horse in the yard, and she looked out the window and saw him before he saw her, which gave her a few seconds to arrange herself into something that was not the reaction she felt. He looked well. That was always the first thing. The way Doyle looked well regardless of circumstances, as though the consequences of his choices were absorbed by the people around him rather than by his own face. He was 34 now, with their father's coloring and a rancher's coat that was too new to have been earned and too expensive to have been bought honestly. He sat on his horse and looked at the house and the yard with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man calculating value, adding things up and subtracting them and arriving at a number. She went outside. He turned when he heard the door, and his expression shifted through several things in quick succession, surprise and something that might have been guilt, and then the ease that always followed both of those things in Doyle, the easy adjustment to whatever surface was required. He swung down from the horse and spread his hands in the gesture she knew, the gesture that said, "Here I am," and "Here I am" was always offered by Doyle, as though it were itself an apology sufficient to the occasion. "Vera," he said, "you look well." "Doyle," she said. He heard the flatness of it, and his smile adjusted slightly. "I heard you arrived safely. I'm glad. Are you?" She stood on the porch and did not come down the steps. "You sent a letter to the stagecoach company confirming my travel arrangements. You filed a contract with the local justice using my name. You took money from a man on the basis of an agreement I knew nothing about, and then you left before I arrived." She kept her voice even. "Which part of that were you glad about?" "The part where you're standing there in one piece," he said, with the tone of a man who finds directness slightly exhausting. "Vera, I know you're angry." "I'm not angry," she said. "Angry is what I was 3 weeks ago on a coach I hadn't planned to be on. What I am now is clear." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him recalibrate, reading the distance between them and adjusting accordingly. Doyle was not stupid. He had never been stupid. He was hollow, as Sutter had said, and hollow things could be very clear, very resonant when you knew how to strike them. He was reading her now and deciding what approach would work. She did not give him the approach. "What do you want?" she said. He glanced at the house behind her, at the yard, at the barn in the distance, measuring. "I want to help sort this out," he said. "The contract, the confusion. I have a solution. I know about Holt," she said. He went still. Not completely. Doyle was too practiced for complete stillness, but the quality of his movement changed, became more contained. "What about Holt? I know he sent you here. I know what the contract was meant to do and why the timing mattered. I know about the ledger errors and the water rights account and the offer he made Sutter twice before he decided that a different kind of pressure was needed." She watched his face. "You were paid to come here and do damage. Not to Sutter directly, because that would be too obvious. To his standing, his credibility. A man who sends for a bride and ends up in a scandal about a fraudulent contract is easier to isolate from community support than a man with a clean reputation." Doyle was quiet for a long moment. The horse shifted behind him, and he put a hand on its neck without looking, the automatic gesture. "That's a complicated story," he said finally. "It's an accurate one." He looked at her with something that was not quite remorse, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who knows he has been caught and is now performing the version of himself that acknowledges it. She had seen this before too, and she knew exactly how long it lasted and what came after. "Vera, I needed the money. It was a straightforward job, and it didn't seem like anyone would be seriously hurt." "I would have been seriously hurt," she said. "I was already hurt. You used my name, Doyle, not a stranger's, mine. You were better placed to handle it than most," he said, and she heard in it the particular logic he had always used, the logic that told him her competence was a resource he was entitled to draw on, that her ability to manage things justified his reliance on them being managed. She had heard it her entire life, and she was done hearing it. "There is a solution," she said. "One solution. You go to the justice and you sign a statement acknowledging that the signature on the contract is not mine, and that you filed it without my knowledge or consent. You do that, and I won't bring what I know about your arrangement with Holt to anyone who might make official use of it. You don't do it, and I will." She kept her eyes on his. "That's the offer. It doesn't improve with time." He looked at her for a long time. She watched him work through it, the angles, the exits, the possibility that she was bluffing. She was not bluffing, and he would know that if he thought about it long enough, because she had never bluffed, not once in all the years they had been at variance with one another. She said what she meant, and she meant what she said, which was a trait he found inconvenient, and she had declined to change. "I'll think about it," he said. "Don't take long," she said, and went back inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wall, and her eyes closed and breathed. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her slightly. She had expected them to shake. But there was something clarifying about saying a thing you have been building toward for weeks, something that settled rather than agitated. She heard Doyle's horse in the yard moving away, and then the sound of it fading down the road toward town, and then nothing but the usual sounds of the ranch, the wind, the cattle, the creak of Duskfield holding itself together against the weather. She was still in the hallway when Sutter came in from the east field. He stopped when he saw her, reading the hallway the way he read everything, quickly and without performance. "Your brother," he said. "Yes." I saw him leaving. He looked at her face. What did he say? She told him, and she watched him listen with the same quality of attention he brought to the ledger, ordering things as they arrived. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You shouldn't have faced him alone. I know you well enough by now to know you'd have said exactly what I said," she told him, but with fewer words and considerably more silence. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, the almost smile she had catalogued without meaning to. "That's probably true," he said. He set his hat on the hook by the door. "He'll go to Holt before he decides. I know. Holt will tell him the statement won't matter if the water board meeting goes the wrong way first." He looked at the shelf where the corrected ledger sat. "So Holt will try to move the meeting." She had not thought of that sequence, but she followed it immediately and saw that he was right. When? As soon as he can arrange it. Tomorrow, if he has the standing on the board to call a special session. He looked at the window, at the late afternoon light going orange across the yard. "I should send word to the board members I trust tonight." "Do it," she said. "I'll have additional documentation ready by morning. There are 2 more entries in the secondary ledger that I haven't copied out yet." He nodded and reached for his coat, and then he stopped and turned back, and she had the sense he was going to say something that required stopping for. "What you said to your brother," he began, "about using your name, not a stranger's." He paused. "That's the part that cost you most." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." He held her eyes for a moment, and in his she saw not sympathy exactly, but recognition, the look of someone who understands a specific kind of hurt from the inside rather than from observation. Then he put his coat back on and went out to send word, and she went to the study and opened the secondary ledger and began to write. The water board meeting was called for the following afternoon, and Vera knew when she walked into the meeting room behind Sutter that Holt had arranged the seating and the order of proceedings the way a man arranges a room where he expects to win, with purpose and detail and the confidence of someone who has done this before and expects to do it the same way again. There were 7 men on the water board, and Holt had 3 of them in positions nearest him when they arrived, a geometry that was not accidental. The room was a large back room of the town hall, plain and utilitarian, with a long table and chairs and windows that let in the gray afternoon light without warmth. Other ranchers from the surrounding properties were seated along the walls, observers with standing in the community and interest in the outcome, and when Vera and Sutter came in, she felt the quality of their attention, the particular alertness of people who have been told that something worth watching is about to happen. Holt was already there, positioned at the far end of the table with the ease of a host, though the room was not his. He looked at Vera when she entered, and his expression did not change in any way she could identify, which was itself a kind of message. The board chairman called the session to order. Holt had filed a motion to review the water rights accounts for all properties on the shared agreement, citing concerns about accuracy, and this was presented as the official purpose of the session. The framing was elegant. It made what he was doing sound like due diligence, civic responsibility, the reasonable exercise of community oversight. It made Sutter's corrected ledger look, before it was even presented, like a defensive response rather than the truth. She had anticipated this, sitting in the study the night before, and she had prepared for it the way she used to prepare for her father's creditors, by building the argument from the ground up rather than in response to whatever arrived, so that the shape of it was complete before it needed to be deployed. The chairman opened the floor to presentations, and Holt went first because he had arranged to go first, and he presented his concerns about Duskfield's water rights account in the smooth, persuasive way of a man accustomed to rooms like this. The figures he cited were the incorrect ones, the ones from the original ledger, before the transposition had been found and corrected. He was careful, and he was thorough, and he was completely wrong. And he knew exactly how wrong he was, which was the thing she watched for in his face as he spoke. The infinitesimal difference between a man who believes what he is saying and a man who knows what he is doing. When he finished, the chairman turned to Sutter, and Sutter stood and placed the corrected ledger on the table. He did not present it himself. He looked at Vera, and she stood and presented it, because it was her work, and the argument would be clearer from the person who had made it. She went through it without rushing. The original entries, the transposition, the correction, the effect on the running total, and therefore on Duskfield's apparent position in the water rights account. She had brought the secondary ledger as well, with the additional entries she had copied out the night before, and she walked the board through the discrepancy between what the secondary ledger showed and what had been reported. And she did it in the plain sequential way she had learned was most effective with men who were accustomed to dealing in numbers and distrusted anything that felt like an appeal to something other than arithmetic. 3 of the 7 board members were leaning forward by the time she finished. 2 of Holt's 3 had stopped looking at him and were looking at the ledger instead. Holt objected. He did it smoothly, citing the provenance of the documentation, questioning when the corrections had been made, and on what basis, suggesting that a woman who had arrived in Harrow Bend under disputed circumstances was perhaps not the most reliable source of financial documentation for a contested property. He was measured and he was civil, and the subtext was precise, designed to redirect the room from what she had shown them to who she was and whether she could be trusted. It was here that the door at the back of the room opened. Vera did not look immediately. She was watching the board members' faces, tracking where the argument was landing, and she felt the shift in the room's attention before she turned to see its cause. When she turned, Doyle was standing in the doorway. He looked different than he had in the yard. Less easy. He had the look of a man who had been doing something difficult and had not yet decided whether he was glad he had done it. He was holding a folded document, and he looked at Vera across the room, and she looked back, and neither of them spoke. He walked to the chairman and placed the document on the table in front of him. "I have a statement," he said, "regarding the contract filed with the local justice under the name Vera Ashton. The signature on that document is not hers. I signed it myself, acting without her knowledge or consent. I was engaged to come to Harrow Bend and undertake actions intended to damage the standing of Duskfield Ranch on behalf of a third party." He paused. The third party is present in this room. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room full of people are all revising something at the same time. Holt was the first to speak, and he spoke with the edge of a man who has had the ground shifted beneath him and is trying to find purchase. "This is a written and witnessed statement," Doyle said. He had the flat delivery of someone reading from a prepared text inside his own head. "Witnessed this morning by the Justice of Harrow Bend." Vera looked at her brother, at his face in this moment, and she saw something she had not expected. Not remorse, not guilt, but something quieter than either. Something that looked like the expression of a man who has put down a weight he did not fully acknowledge he was carrying. It would not last. She knew Doyle well enough to know it would not last. that by next week or next month, he would have arranged the story differently in his own memory, redistributed the angles until he was more at the center of the principled action and less at the center of the cause that required it. But here, now, in this room, he had done the thing she had asked him to do, and she held that for what it was worth, which was considerable, and which she would not reduce by adding qualifications to it in her own mind. The board did not immediately rule. They called a recess, and in the recess Vera stood near the window on the far side of the room, and Sutter came and stood beside her, not saying anything, looking out at the street where the afternoon light was beginning to go. "He came," Sutter said. "Yes." "You weren't certain he would." "No," she said. "I was not." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wagon moved along the street, and a woman on the far boardwalk pulled her coat closer against the wind. Ordinary life, going on in its ordinary way, unaware that anything particular was being decided in the room behind the town hall windows. "When this is settled," Sutter said slowly, as though he was working out the sentence as he went, "the contract will be voided. You'll have no legal obligation to remain at Duskfield." She looked at him. He was still looking out the window. "I know," she said. "I want you to understand that I understand that," he said. He paused. "What you've done here, the ledger, the documentation, today, none of it obligates you to anything beyond what you agreed to at the start." She waited because there was more, and she had learned to wait for it. "But I would like you to stay," he said. "Not because the ranch needs the bookkeeping, though it does. Not because of the water board or Holt or any of the rest of it." He turned then and looked at her with the same open quality she had seen in the barn when he spoke about Cade, the unguarded look of a man who has said something true and is letting it stand without armor. "Because the house is different with you in it. Because Cade lets you near him, which he doesn't do with strangers. Because you left the shoe where it was." He stopped. "Because I said we the other night, and I didn't mean to take it back." She looked at him for a long time, at this man who had given her a key and prepared a room and carried a small shoe from one room to another because he could not put it somewhere he couldn't find it. At the face that gave nothing away until it gave everything, and even then gave it quietly, without fanfare, without the expectation of immediate return. "I heard you say it," she said. "I didn't correct you." He held her eyes. "No," he said. "You didn't." The chairman called the board back to order before she could say more, and they turned and walked back into the room together, and the session resumed, and Vera sat beside Sutter at the long table with the corrected ledger between them and Doyle's statement in the chairman's hands, and she thought about the key on the table beside the candle in the small room, and the window that faced east, and the way the stars had come in over the ridge after the storm cleared, bright and specific in the clean air. The board deliberated for 20 minutes. When the chairman announced the ruling, Duskfield's water rights account confirmed as correctly reported, the original discrepancy attributed to clerical error to be noted in the official record, Cress Holt's motion dismissed. Holt stood, and the room watched him stand, and what the room saw in his face was the thing he could not control in that moment, the particular cold anger of a man who has planned something thoroughly and watched it fail anyway. He left without speaking to anyone, and the room let him go, and the conversation that filled the space he left had the energized quality of people who have witnessed something decisive and are processing it together, exclamation and question, and the natural momentum of a resolution reached. Vera sat still in the midst of it and felt the day settling around her like sediment after disturbed water, everything finding its level. Beside her, Sutter sat with his hands on the table and his face in the particular stillness that was his version of relief. And she thought about what he had said at the window, the slow, careful way he had assembled the words, and she thought about what she had not yet said in return. She looked over at the door where Doyle had been standing, but he was gone. He had left sometime during the deliberation, quietly, in the way he did everything that required no further performance from him. She did not know where he would go. She had never known where Doyle went between the things he did. He moved through the world in the spaces between consequences, and she had spent enough of her life trying to understand it to know that she would not spend more. She looked forward at the chairman thanking the board members, at the ranchers along the wall beginning to stand and collect their hats, at the window where the afternoon had gone fully gray and the first suggestion of evening was beginning to arrive at the edges of the sky, at Sutter's hands on the table, still and certain and present. She put her hand beside his, not on top of it, not reaching for it, just beside it, close enough that the sides of their hands were touching, the small, firm warmth of it, the simple fact of contact. He looked down at their hands, and then he looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said yet, and they had both learned, in their different ways, that silence correctly timed was not absence. It was the most honest thing she knew how to offer, and he received it the way he received everything she had given him in these weeks, without demanding more of it than it was, and without pretending it was less. The ride back to Duskfield was quiet in the way that follows something large, not the quiet of emptiness, but of fullness, the way a room feels after music has stopped, still carrying the shape of what was in it. The road home ran west into the last of the light, and the horses moved at an easy pace, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which did not feel like the absence of conversation, but like a continuation of it by other means. Vera watched the land go past, the dry grass bending in the evening wind, the far hills going dark against the sky in the graduated way of things that are not disappearing, but simply becoming part of the dark, still there, still holding their shape. She thought about the waterboard room and the chairman's voice reading the ruling and the feeling that had moved through her when he finished. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and more durable than triumph. The feeling of a thing completed. A weight set down on solid ground. She thought about Doyle in the doorway with the folded document, the look on his face that she had not expected, and she let herself sit with that for a moment without reducing it, without adding the qualifications she would normally add, the reminders of what he had done before and would likely do again. He had come, for whatever reason, with whatever mixture of calculation and something less calculated, he had come and done the thing she had asked. She would hold that separately from the rest of it, not as forgiveness, which required a different conversation and perhaps a different year, but as a fact standing on its own, unattached to what came before or after. When they turned up the road toward Duskfield, Sutter said without preamble, "You should know that the water board ruling doesn't finalize until it's entered in the official record. That takes a few days." "I know," she said. "Holt will be looking for another angle in that time. He won't find one," she said. "The documentation is complete, and it's already with the chairman. There's nothing to contest." He nodded slowly. "You thought ahead." "I've had practice thinking ahead," she said. "It's what you do when you're not in a position to react after the fact." He looked at her sideways, the brief, direct look she had come to recognize as his version of close attention. "Who taught you that?" "Necessity," she said, the same teacher as most things worth knowing. The corner of his mouth moved. She watched it happen and felt something that was not quite fondness, or perhaps was exactly fondness, the word she had been avoiding because it felt too small for what it was covering and too large for what she was certain of. They came into the yard as the last of the light was leaving the sky, and Vera climbed down and stood for a moment in the yard while Sutter unhitched the horses, moving through the familiar task with the economy she had watched every evening since she arrived, each motion in its right place, nothing wasted. She had stopped seeing it as efficiency and started seeing it as a kind of care, the care of a man who attended to what was in front of him, because what was in front of him mattered. Because the horse needed to be unhitched, and the gear needed to be stored, and the barn needed to be settled, and all of those things were worth doing correctly. She went inside and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the barn where the lamplight was visible through the gap in the door, a thin, warm line in the dark. The kitchen was the same as it had always been, the shelf with the cups, the table with its 2 chairs, the stove with its low fire, and all of it had the quality now of something familiar rather than something learned. The difference, so small, she could not have said precisely when it happened, only that it had. She made tea and poured 2 cups and set his on the counter near the stove where he always stood when he came in cold, and she sat at the table with her own and waited, and when he came in from the barn and hung his coat and turned and saw the cup already there, she watched his face receive it, the small, unconscious softening of a man encountering something he had not asked for and had not expected and found that he was glad of. He picked up the cup and stood at the counter and drank, and she sat at the table and drank. And the kitchen held them both in its low, warm light, and the wind moved around the outside of the house in the searching way it had, and the fire in the stove made its quiet sounds, and for a long moment neither of them needed to say anything at all. Then Vera set down her cup. "I went to the justice this morning," she said, "before the board meeting." He looked at her. "I gave him a copy of the corrected ledger and the additional documentation, and I gave him a written account of what I know about the arrangement between Holt and Doyle and how it relates to the contract filing." She paused. "He said it was sufficient to initiate a separate review of Holt's conduct with respect to the contract. That's independent of the water board ruling." Sutter was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me you were doing that." "No," she said. "I didn't want you to tell me not to." He looked at her steadily. "Would I have? You might have said it wasn't necessary, that the water board ruling was enough." She met his eyes. "It wasn't enough. The contract was a separate harm, and it deserved a separate accounting. Doyle's statement addresses the forgery, but the intent behind it, the arrangement, the money paid, that needed to be in the official record somewhere." He was quiet for a longer moment this time, and she waited because she had learned to wait and because she genuinely did not know what he would say, which was one of the things about him that she had not grown accustomed to and suspected she would not. "You're right," he said. "It wasn't enough." She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. He set down his cup and came to the table and sat in the other chair, the one across from hers. And she was struck again by how rarely he sat in this room, how usually he passed through it on his way to somewhere else. And the sitting had a quality of intention to it, of having decided to be still. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it the way you answer things, which is directly." "All right," she said. "When you told your brother the offer, the terms for the statement, you said you wouldn't bring what you knew about his arrangement to anyone who might make official use of it. And then this morning, you gave the justice Exactly that information. He looked at her without accusation, but with the steady attention of a man who wanted to understand something. Why? She had thought about this. She had thought about it on the walk to the justice's office, and in the room afterward, and on the road to the board meeting, and in the intervals of the day when her mind was not occupied with something more immediate. "Because I made an offer to my brother and he accepted it," she said. "The statement he signed was the consideration I asked for, and I won't use what he told me about his arrangement with Holt. Not directly. What I gave the justice came from the ledger and from the timeline of events and from the letter I found." She paused. "I kept the specific things Doyle told me out of it. What I put in the record is what I found by other means." Sutter looked at her for a long moment. "That's a careful distinction." "It's an accurate one," she said. "I didn't promise him immunity. I promised him I wouldn't bring what he told me. I didn't tell him what I'd already found." She looked at her hands around the cup. "He probably knows the difference. He may not care, but it matters to me." "Why does it matter to you?" he said, "when what he did to you didn't seem to operate on the same standard?" The question was not unkind. It was genuine. The question of a man trying to understand the architecture of something he respected, but could not yet fully map. She thought about how to answer it, and then answered it the way she had answered most of the true things she had said in this house, without preparation from wherever the truth actually lived. "Because I don't want to become the kind of person who doesn't keep distinctions," she said. "Doyle erased the line between his word and my name because he needed to, and because he thought I wouldn't be able to hold him to account. If I erase the line between what I promised and what I do, I become someone who operates the same way he does, just with better intentions." She looked up. "I don't think intentions are enough. I think you have to hold the line in the specific place you drew it, even when it's inconvenient." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking the same thing for years about a different problem, and I've never been able to put it into words like that." She looked at him. "Which problem?" "Staying," he said, "after Fenn, after his mother left. Every season there was a reason to sell, a reason to go. A reason that would have been defensible and even reasonable. Holt's offers were not always unfair. The land is hard. The work doesn't stop." He looked at his hands on the table, the calloused, honest hands of a man who had not taken the reasonable option. "But I drew a line somewhere early on about what this place meant. And I didn't want to be the kind of person who moved the line because the circumstances made it easier, even when I couldn't entirely explain why." Vera looked at him, at the face that gave so little away until it gave everything, and she thought about the barn and the horse and the shoe under the bed and the key given without explanation, and she thought about the way he had stood in the waterboard room at the window and assembled the sentence slowly and said, "I would like you to stay with the particular care of a man who meant every word of it, and was not in the habit of saying things he did not mean. The contract will be voided," she said, "when the justice processes Doyle's statement." "Yes," he said. "When that happens, I'll have no legal reason to be here." "No," he said. "I want to stay," she said. Not quickly, not with the rush of someone afraid the offer will be withdrawn, but at the pace of something that had arrived at its own time. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have other options now. The justice mentioned that a neighboring town is looking for someone to manage their civic records, and I could do that. I have skills that are portable." She looked at him steadily. I want to stay because Duskfield is the first place I've been in a long time where what I am is what's needed. Not a reduced version of it. Not a convenient version. The actual thing." She paused. "And because you said we and didn't take it back." He looked at her with the open look, the one without armor, and she held it and did not look away. "Then stay," he said. Not as the woman in the arranged contract. Not as the bookkeeper or the person who fixed the porch or the person who found the ledger errors, though you're all of those things. He paused. "Stay as someone who chose to." "I'm choosing to," she said. He reached across the table then, slowly, in the way he did everything that required care, and he put his hand over hers where it rested beside the cup, and she felt the weight and warmth of it, the roughness of the palm, the particular, solid reality of a hand that had worked hard for a long time and knew how to be gentle with things that warranted it. She turned her hand under his, and their fingers settled together in the way of things that have found their arrangement and are not planning to argue about it. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen, in the low light, while the fire made its small sounds, and the wind moved around outside, and the house settled into the night with the particular sounds of a structure that has been standing a long time and plans to continue. In the morning, she went to the justice's office and sat across the desk from him while he read through the statement Doyle had signed and the documentation she had provided and the copy of the ledger, and then he looked up and told her that the contract would be formally voided within the week pending the standard recording process, and that the review of the conduct surrounding its filing would proceed as a separate matter. He said it in the careful, measured way of a man discharging an official function, and she received it the same way. And when she thanked him and stood to go, he said, with a slight unbending of his official manner, that Harrow Bend was not generally in the habit of attracting this kind of complexity, and that he was glad it had been sorted. She walked out of the justice's office into a morning that had gone clear overnight. The sky overhead a clean deep blue with the particular brightness that comes after weather. Everything washed and defined, the edges of buildings and the shapes of trees, and the distant line of the hills all sharper than they had been for days. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and breathed it, the cold, clean air, the smell of the town in the morning, wood smoke and horses, and the faint mineral smell of the earth after rain. Mrs. Crail was sweeping the porch of the general store across the street, and she looked up and saw Vera and gave a nod of the specific quality that meant she was aware of what had transpired and had formed an opinion that was not unfavorable. Vera nodded back, and that was sufficient, the small currency of a community in the process of revising its assessment. She walked to the livery where she had left the horse and rode back toward Duskfield on the same road she had walked that first afternoon, weeks ago now, when she had gone into town without telling Sutter and come back with the shape of Holt's plan beginning to form in her mind. The land looked different in the morning clarity, the grass silver and pale, the shadows of the hills long across the lower ground, the sky enormous and specific in the way it was only when the air was fully clear. She was halfway home when she came over a low rise and saw Sutter in the field to the left of the road, working along the fence line with the easy, purposeful movement she had watched from the window on her first morning and many mornings since. He did not hear her immediately, and she had a moment of watching him, unobserved, the way she had watched him that first morning, and she thought about how different the watching felt now. Not the assessment of a stranger cataloging an unknown quantity, but something warmer and more specific. The attention of a person looking at someone they know. He looked up when the horse's hooves changed on the harder ground near the fence, and he saw her, and he raised one hand in the brief, unsentimental greeting she had come to understand as his version of a welcome. And she lifted her hand in return and rode to the fence and stopped. "Well," he said. "Within the week," she said. "The justice said, within the week." He nodded, the small nod of confirmation, and turned back to the fence post he was working on, and she sat on the horse and watched him for a moment. "I also told him," she said, "that I'd be at Duskfield indefinitely if he needed to reach me for the review proceedings." He looked up at that. She met his eyes. "Indefinitely," he said. "It seemed like the accurate word," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and something in his face was very still and very full at the same time. The face of a man who has heard the word he did not know he was waiting for. Then he looked back at the fence post and resumed work. And she dismounted and tied the horse to the fence rail and came to hold the post steady while he tamped the earth, because she had learned how to do it from watching him, and it went faster with two. They worked the length of the fence in the clear morning, finding the places that needed attention and attending to them. And when they finished, they stood at the end of the line and looked back along the repaired fence toward the house, the barn behind it, the wide land on all sides going out to the hills. It was Sutter who moved first. He turned toward the barn, and she fell into step beside him, and they walked across the yard the way they had done many times now, with the particular ease of people who have found their pace with one another. And when they came into the barn, Cade turned his head and regarded Vera with the mild, surprised expression that was simply his face. And she went to him, and he put his nose into her hand, warm and certain, the gesture of an animal who has decided. She stood with the horse's nose in her hand and felt the barn around her, the smell of hay and leather, and the particular warmth that accumulated in a space where animals had been kept for a long time. She thought about the small shoe still resting under the bed in the east-facing room, and about Fenn, who had been loud and always moving, and about Cade standing patient as a stone while small hands reached up to touch his nose. She thought about the window she had pushed open after the storm with Sutter standing beside her, both of them pressing against the swollen frame until it gave, and the air that came through it afterward, clean and searching, filling every corner of the room that had been closed for too long. "He's doing better," Sutter said from behind her, where he was hanging the tools along the barn wall. "The leg." "I can see that," she said. "He's putting weight on it evenly now." "Noticed that this morning." He came to stand beside her at the stall, looking at the horse with the specific quality of attention she had first catalogued in the barn weeks ago, the care that was different from how he looked at everything else. "He's a good judge of people," he said. "Always has been." "Then I'm glad he approves of me," she said. "He approved of you early," Sutter said. "Earlier than I expected." She looked at him. "Earlier than you?" He looked back at her with a direct honesty she had not known she was hungry for until she found it. "About the same time," he said. "I was just slower to admit it." She smiled. It was not a complicated smile or a performed one, just the thing that happened when something landed in the right place, the simplest version of an expression she had learned to economize over years of living in her father's house, and then in the various reduced circumstances that followed. Sutter saw it, and something in his own face eased in response. The easing of a man who has been watching for something and has seen it arrive. Later, they walked back to the house together, and she put water on for coffee, and he sat at the table, actually sat, the way he had the night before, with the quality of someone who had decided the table was a place worth sitting. She set the cups out, and when the coffee was ready, she poured and brought his to the table and sat across from him. And the morning light came through the kitchen window and laid itself across the table between them in the particular way of light that has traveled a long distance to arrive at something specific. "There's a fence on the north boundary that needs more than patching," Sutter said. "I've been putting it off because it's a week's work and I haven't had time." "Tell me what it needs," she said, "and I'll help plan the materials." "You don't know how to build fence." "I didn't know how to patch fence either," she said. "You showed me." He looked at her with the almost smile, and this time it completed itself, fully. The smile of a man who is not accustomed to the expression, but has found a reason sufficient to the effort. It changed his face entirely. The way a window opened in a closed room changes the quality of everything inside it, not just the light, but the air itself, the feeling of space. She looked at him smiling in the morning light in the kitchen of Duskfield Ranch and thought about indefinitely the word she had chosen with care because it was accurate and because it was honest and because it was large enough to hold what she actually meant, which was larger than she had words for yet, and which she was in no hurry to find the exact edges of. There was time. That was the thing she had not had in a long time, and had not realized she had lost until she found it again here, in this kitchen, in this house, on this land that had been prepared and tended and refused to be given up. Time to find the edges. Time to learn the north fence and the water board's quarterly schedule, and the names of all the cattle and the way the light moved across the yard through different seasons. Time to be in a place long enough to become part of it and for it to become part of her. She picked up her coffee cup and drank, and across the table, Sutter did the same, and the kitchen held them in its ordinary morning light, and outside, Duskfield stretched out in all directions in the clear air, the grass and the fence lines and the far hills. And somewhere in the barn Cade stood in his stall with his leg healing and his nose in the hay. And the house was not silent, but full of the sounds of itself, the fire and the wind and the creak of timber that had stood long enough to know how to hold. The window that faced east had been opened on the morning after the storm, both of them standing side by side to push against the swollen frame until it gave. And it had stayed open since, the air moving through it freely in the way of things that have stopped being shut against the weather. She had not closed it at night. She had found that she liked the sound the wind made coming through it, the searching sound that had seemed lonely to her at first and now seemed like something else, something more like the sound of a place that knew it was inhabited, that could feel the warmth of the rooms it moved around, and was simply making note of it, the way places do when they have been empty for a long time and then are no longer. Vera set down her cup and looked across the table at Sutter Graye, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because the thing between them had not yet accumulated enough language to require it, and the silence was the right kind. The kind that does not need to be filled because it is already full. Outside, the morning was going on. The land was going on. And inside the house at Duskfield, in the kitchen with the low fire and the 2 cups on the table, the day was just beginning, and there was time. And they were both, for the first time in a long time, in no particular hurry to be anywhere other than exactly where they were.